Hey there, Mike Lawrence, lead pastor here at Faith Community Church. One church, 3 campuses. We got our online campus, and then our Framingham campus is now moving indoors in their new location, and the Hopkinton campus has been meeting outdoors. We'll be going indoors in November. How's that for motion? Hey, I'm so glad to be here with you this morning. A couple of questions for you. Who out there wants to live a good life? Throw up the like sign or the love symbol. Just, do you want to live a good life? I mean, who wants to live a bad life, right? But have you ever really wondered, how good is, good enough? You're struggling because you want to be good and do good and leave a good legacy behind, but you're not quite sure what that means. And maybe you're hoping it's kind of like a zero-sum game where you're hoping that the good equals and balances out the bad, or maybe exceeds it a little bit, but you don't know. You're feeling a little insecure. In the back of your head, you may even be wondering, what does that mean about God? How good is good enough for God? Well, we're going into a brand new series. We're calling it Cultivating the Good Life, and it's all based on these questions. And we're going to turn to some ancient advice for this. We're going to go to Paul of Tarsus. You might know him as the Apostle Paul or St. Paul. He's one of the most significant leaders in the history of the church after Jesus. I mean, this is a guy who helped forge our Christian belief. This is a guy who planted churches all throughout the Mediterranean region of the world in his day. This is a guy who faced tremendous obstacles and overcame them just to talk to people about Jesus Christ and to proclaim what he called the good news about Jesus. He was a real phenomenal guy. We have built monuments to him, right? I mean, there are churches and universities, and there are whole cities and hospitals, right, that are named after St. Paul. So we're going to look to him because Paul is a guy who really cared about living a good life. We're going to look at a letter that he wrote, and in this letter, he describes a path that he found to the good life. Not an easy life, a good life. I mean, the letter that we're looking at for this study, it's a letter called Galatians. It's in what we call the New Testament. It's towards the back end of our Bibles. He wrote it from prison. And so we know that the good life doesn't always lead us through easy times, but it gives us a real sense of purpose and joy. And we're doing this as part of what I call the Synergy series. I love Synergy series. We typically do one every fall, right? It's where we take Sunday mornings and we take faith group studies and we take daily readings from the Bible and we kind of bring it all together in a way that really creates synergy. Our kids and our teens and our adults are working on it, and you saw it just a little bit earlier, the outreach. Because we think the good life means you do good, we're finding a way to empower our neighbors to help people who really need food. Isn't that exciting? So here's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to take a look at Paul's past in order to understand the present in which he was writing this letter in the hopes that maybe it would give you a new future. How do you like that? That was pretty cool, right? Understanding his past to get a handle on his present as he wrote the letter, and maybe that'll give you a new future. Well, let me pray. God, I've been praying for this for a long time. I believe that what Paul has to say and what he's written in this letter to Galatians, that it can change our lives. Throughout history, people have wrestled with the teachings that Paul supplies through this simple little letter, and it has revolutionized their life. And so, God, I am praying that through this series, that you who hear me, my God and my Father, to Jesus Christ who has opened up this relationship, that you would take these words and you would infuse them with power and you would release them to do good in people's lives. Just want to do good and to be good with you, Father. And I know you want that too. So I love you. Amen. See, take a look at Paul's past, because that's going to help us really understand the things that he's saying in this letter. Paul was a pretty unique guy because Paul had a passion from early in his life to be good and to do good and to really know that he was good with God. We look to a different letter. It's called Philippians. It comes after Galatians, and where he describes his life before Jesus. And listen to what he writes. Though I could have confidence in my own effort, if anyone could. Indeed, if others have reason for confidence in their efforts, I have even more. I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew, if ever there was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demanded the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without fault. I once thought these things were valuable. Hear what Paul is saying? When it came to the good life and knowing if he was good with God, you know what Paul thought? Well, I was born into the right family. It was his faith was sort of a birthright for him. You know those conversations you have with people like, well, do you have a religion? Do you practice? Like, oh yeah, I was born Catholic. I was born Protestant. It's this idea that my security comes in the family in which I was born. And it even talks about some of the rituals. Paul was circumcised as a child. And people find great comfort in like, well, I was baptized as an infant. My parents did that. So I guess that's my faith, and that's kind of where I come from. And you're hoping that gives you some credibility with God. Or it could be the education. I mean, Paul talks about being a Pharisee. Pharisees were scholars. They had to go for a great education in order to study the Bible and to teach other people how to live according to it. It's like, I went to a Catholic university. I went to a really good Christian college. Or maybe you feel like the education you got made you a good person, or at least taught you how to be good. And if Paul was a Pharisee, and he says it right here, I obeyed the law without fault, there's a lot that's packed into those little words. It meant that he really worked hard to do the right thing according to his belief system. That would have dictated his relationships, his business practices, his food preparation, his travel itinerary. It would affect every single area of his life, which meant that as a Pharisee, Paul would have been almost obsessed about always trying to do the right thing under every circumstance. Imagine that. And Paul hides in this passage. He doesn't hide it, but it's tucked in there. I harshly persecuted the church. Paul's path to becoming a good person led him to become a religious extremist. He mentions that in this letter that we're studying in Galatians. This is where, first of all, I really want to say and encourage you that bring a Bible to these messages. Put it on your phone. It's called the Bible app. It's not hard to find, right? And then if I start pointing out passages from the Bible, it's so easy for you to just find them by going to the book. So when I say like Galatians, you go to Galatians. When I say chapter 1, that's the next screen. And when I say verse 13, that's the next screen. And you can read along with me and go back to these. So Paul said, he goes, you know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion? How I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the tradition of my ancestors. This is not hyperbole. In our own history book, what we learn is that Paul was dedicated to violently persecuting Christians. He literally wanted to destroy the movement. That was his devotion, and that was his passion. He was a religious extremist, and he would take it to far ends. Paul is talking in this little passage when he talks about the violence and the destruction. In the back of his mind, I know what he's thinking about is the death of a human being. It's the story in our history book. Our history book is called the Acts of the Apostle. It's their story after Jesus left. And Paul's talking about a path that he took in where a man died because of his faith. A man named Stephen. A man who had just devoted himself to following Jesus Christ and to trying to do good. And it so threatened Paul's security that he started to persecute the church to the point of imprisoning people and even to encourage them dying. Now, we don't have any evidence that he participated in actually killing Stephen, but it's clear that Paul approved of it and was present at the moment. It's right here in the story. It's in what we call Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 60. And Saul approved of killing him. You should know, by the way, that Saul is another name for Paul. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him, but Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them into prison. And there it is. There it is, Saul, another name for Paul, supporting violence, even inciting it, to the point where he would drag people from their homes to send them to prison. And he would stand by and encourage a crowd to kill a human being. And this is religion at its worst. And isn't it sad that in Paul's passionate pursuit of the good life, in a life that would make him good with God, that would lead to an act that he would always regret. This is part of Paul's history, and you see it in his writings. He always refers back to those days when he would persecute and violently oppose and destroy. It was a memory of his life that wouldn't go away. And the irony is, it came out of his pursuit to be good with God. He would wrestle with that. And I've seen that throughout my life and career. I've had these incredible conversations with people who are so passionately committed to being good with God and to doing good. And what I see is I see their life shrinking into a life of isolation. As either they're afraid of people who will contaminate them, like they will carry some type of disease by association that will infect their faith, or they don't want to associate with anybody who doesn't believe with them, and so their friendships and their circles get consistently smaller. They wrestle with an insecurity because no matter what they do, no matter how hard they try, they just don't know secretly in their hearts if they're really good enough with God. And there's a little bit of fear mixed in there. They're exhausted from trying so hard all the time to just be good. And sometimes there's a sense of arrogance around them. You know that arrogance of I'm right and you're wrong and there's no discussion? It's an arrogance that comes out even like while in pride. And you don't want to be around them. Paul's path led him to violence, but I've seen it lead other people to different emotions like anger and a harsh, critical spirit, a nature. These are the people that maybe you don't want to be around because the way that they talk to you is so demeaning and so aggressive that you'd rather avoid them. It's sad. I just want to say, if you've been in this pursuit and you feel like your circle of friendships is shrinking, that there's an insecurity inside of you, just a fatigue. If people say they can't stand you or they're avoiding you, they don't want to have another conversation with you because they're just tired of you being so angry, maybe you're pursuing the good life the wrong way. That's what Paul discovered. Now, I love this little statement that's embedded in this letter that we're reading and we're talking about. It's from Galatians, right? Chapter 1, verse 15. And listen to what Paul writes. But even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. And then it pleased him to reveal his son to me so that I could proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. What an amazing little phrase, right? That I would proclaim the good news about Jesus. This was a guy devoted to destroying the church. And now here he is telling everybody what he calls good news about Jesus Christ. This is the radical life change that happened in Paul's life. So God turned Paul's life around. I don't know if you know anyone like this, but it happened to me. It's like you see somebody on a given path or a given trajectory, and then they have this moment or this experience, or they go through this season, and it's like, I call it a great paradigm shift. They see the world differently suddenly. Because they see the world differently, it affects everything about them. It revolutionizes their life. And it leads them to a better place, even to a security in their relationship with God. Paul had one of those. We call it the Damascus Road experience because he was on the road to an ancient city called Damascus when it happened. Again, let's go back to our Bible, our history book, Acts chapter 9 now, picking up with verse 3. As he was approaching Damascus on his mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone around him, and he fell to the ground. He heard a voice saying, Saul, again, that's another name for Paul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. And the voice replied, I am Jesus, the one you were persecuting. Now get up and go to the city, and you'll be told what you must do. And the men with Saul stood speechless, for they heard the sound of someone's voice, but saw no one. And Saul picked himself up off the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he was blind, and so his companions led him by the hand to Damascus. And he remained there blind for 3 days and did not eat or drink. I love this. I love all the symbolisms, right? Here is God knocking Paul off his high horse. And then he makes Paul blind, as if he's trying to help Paul understand that this has been a blind pursuit in the wrong direction towards God and towards being good. Paul ends up going back to someone's house where for 3 days he's caught in this condition, worrying, he's blind, he can't see, he doesn't understand what happened, crying out to God. And God sends a man named Ananias who prays for him. And Ananias, in his prayer for Paul, sees scales fall off of Paul's eye. Don't you love that? The scales fell off of Paul's eyes, and he could see the world differently. He saw God differently. And what happened after this is amazing. You pick it up between the book of Acts and the rest of Galatians chapter 1, where Paul suddenly was seeking out people who follow Christ, not to arrest them, but to learn from them. He's like he couldn't get it into him fast enough, just absorbing everything that they could tell him about Jesus. And then he didn't wait, because when God changes your life like this, when Jesus opens up your heart, your mind, your soul, and gives you one of these paradigm shift moments, you just want to tell people about it because it's so cool. And so he began to tell people about it. And it created a stir throughout the whole region, because the guy that was once persecuting is now promoting. What in the world is going on? Paul eventually goes away for a while. He talks about going to Arabia, and he talks about studying, and for years, what we think happened is he just kind of opened up his Bible and just began to really try to understand what God was doing through Jesus Christ. And he studied everything that we would call the Old Testament, and what he began to discover is the footprint of Jesus through those pages. He began to understand that God had a bigger plan that included Jesus, and that he was doing something new and fresh in Jesus. And Paul just fell in love with it, told more people about it. Eventually, he goes to the epicenter of Christianity, Jerusalem. He meets with Peter, one of the great leaders of the church, personally discipled by Jesus. Some of you, if you're Catholic, would know him as St. Peter, the first pope, right? And he shares with Peter the things he knows of faith and the message he's teaching about Jesus. He finds out Jesus' own brother James, and he talks to James. And he just says that, he shares the message with James, and they approve. So Paul knows that the message that he has received from God, the one that he has dug out from all these years of study, the way everything is kind of crystallizing in his mind, is right on track with those who studied under Jesus. And Paul's life is just transformed. It's so transformed. There's a great statement in the book of Galatians. This is Paul writing this. Right? This is in chapter 1. All they knew was that people were saying, the one who used to persecute us is now preaching the very faith he tried to destroy, and they praise God because of me. Isn't that cool? Paul had a past he couldn't escape. He had a reputation that he had earned. But God's in the business of transforming people, of rewriting their past, and of giving them a new reputation and a new purpose. And that's what he did with Paul. And this is your good news. Honestly, this is your good news. Come on, if you've been spending your life trying really hard to be good, to do good, to kind of sit good with God, and it's just leaving you tired and frustrated and angry and lonely, tired, God can liberate you. If you're carrying a past that you're dragging behind you, that's giving you a reputation that you hate, something that's haunting you that you can't get away from, God can transform your past and to give you a new present. Because that's what God did for Paul. He gave him a new present. This is the story of Paul's life. This is why I love the book of Galatians, because it's written by a man who is transformed radically by God. And it contains his core passions and core beliefs. That's why we study it. You know, God's doing things like this all the time, changing people's lives and radically rewriting their past. In a way, it gives validity to their message, because you know who they were, and now you see who they are. And so it's worth paying attention to their words, because they have discovered something worth hearing about God that can change and benefit your life. Some of you guys know I like to run, and when I run, I'll listen to podcasts when I run. I'll listen to a podcast. It was called The Sneak, and it was about this guy, Jack Murphy. His nickname was Murph the Surf. This guy was an extraordinary guy. This is a guy who he played the violin in the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. He earned a D1 scholarship in tennis to the University of Pennsylvania, and he was a world champion surfer. They used to call him Murph the Surf. But that's not the most interesting part about Murph the Surf. He's also known as participating in the greatest jewel heist of the 20th century. He and his friends broke into the New York Museum of Natural History, and they stole some of the most precious gems on exhibit. As a matter of fact, the New York Museum of Natural History couldn't put a price tag on the theft because two of the jewels were considered priceless, one of them being the Star of India. And there was just no way they could put a price tag on it. Well, Murph the Surf got caught. He had been living a life of crime at this point and doing this type of larceny, and it built quite a reputation, and finally it catches up to you and he ends up in prison. But he gets out. And then he gets out, and then something even more tragic happens. He gets caught up in a group of people who have stolen about $500,000 of stocks and bonds. Two young women are involved in the theft. And in a mysterious event that people fully don't understand to this day, those two young women die violently. They're killed. And he was there. He ends up going to prison for life. Life plus 20 years. Here's a guy who had an exciting, stellar life. Infamous in his notoriety. And he discovers Jesus Christ. A prison ministry reaches out to him and starts to talk to him about Christ. And Jack Murphy's life begins to turn around. Now, some people have, religion by convenience when they're in prison. But it seemed like for Jack Murphy, something had really begun to change. Jack began to disciple other prisoners. He began to share the gospel. He began to change his life and clean up his act. Jack became so respected as an inmate of the prison that they gave him an early parole. He became a part of the Bill Glass Prison Ministries. He joined a number of boards of prison ministries. In the course of his lifetime, after coming out of prison, Jack would visit over 1,200 different prisons to share the gospel. He was once offered a job because his public speaking skills were so great that he was offered a lucrative job in the business world, and he turned it down so that he could stay in prison ministries, even though he was hardly making any money. Because Jack just really felt that in his discovery of Jesus Christ, he wanted to bring the good news of Jesus Christ into the prison system, visiting men in solitary lockup, on death row. And it was what was really interesting to me because, like I said, some of these are religion by convenience, and the people running this podcast began to talk to other reporters who had reported on Jack Murphy's life, respectable reporters. And it was interesting to listen to this argument, like, do you really think he had faith? And as they processed it, these are not religious people. What they talked about was, this is a guy who had a remarkable change in his life. It didn't excuse his past, but it gave Jack Murphy a new present. And in that new present, what they saw inside of him, they considered remarkable, even honorable at points. Again, it didn't excuse the past, but it rewrote it. Because this is what God is in the business of doing, of giving us new paths to rewrite ourselves. The path to a good life that doesn't leave you exhausted, but really energizes you and gives you joy and a sense of peace. A path to a good life that frees you from the guilt and the shame of your past. It's a path to a good life where your past, even though it can't be erased, can be redefined, and your life can be repurposed, and you can head into a new direction. Why am I spending so much time talking about this? Because I know that there are some of us out there, you're carrying the weight of your past, and you're thinking you can never get away from it. But what if it could be rewritten? And I know there's some of you that you just so desperately want to be good. You're just trying, but you're insecure, you're afraid, you're lonely, you're exhausted, you're angry. And Paul tells us that there's a different path in a new way. And it's going to be in this book of Galatians. Join us in this study. When I read the book of Galatians, the changes in Paul's life give validity to the things that he says. It makes me really consider his teaching. Because a man that would go from trying to destroy the movement to a man who began to proclaim the movement and become its greatest leader, there is something significant that happened in there that I think was Jesus Christ. And it infuses his teaching with a spiritual power that I think is unique. So join me in this. Listen to these messages. Go to the website, to the Synergy page. Sign up. Download the daily reading journals so that you can read along with us on a daily basis, or use the app. You'll get notifications every day, and there's a little passage, and there's a question. Jump into a faith group. Our faith groups are studying this together. There is a power when we're all studying this together. Maybe it's a power that could change your life. Would you join us and discover a new path? God, I just want to pray. I want to pray that as people hear this, that you will rewrite our lives, freeing us from shame and guilt, freeing us from fear and insecurity and anger and loneliness, putting us on a path towards you, God, that is filled with joy, not easy, but truly good, where we get to know our God, discover our purpose, to know the joy that he has for us, the peace that he provides, and the security that is possible. Amen.